She told me to get out and keep the old ranch, but now I'm richer than her entire family. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of place where time didn't pass so much as sit heavy in the corners. I sat stiffly on the edge of a cracked leather chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, the black fabric of my dress already wrinkled from the hours spent at the church earlier that morning. The funeral had been quiet, restrained, just as Harold would have liked it, and now we sat under flickering fluorescent lights waiting for the final details to be spoken aloud. I tried not to look at the mahogany desk between us like it was a coffin. Quinn sat to my right, arms crossed, lips pressed together in the expression he wore when he didn't want to be bothered. He hadn't said more than a handful of words all day. Next to him, Maisie chewed on her gum in slow, exaggerated circles, her legs crossed too tightly, heels tapping against the floor in a rhythm that screamed impatience. Her nails were too bright for a funeral, blood red, clicking every time she adjusted her phone in her lap. She hadn't cried. She hadn't even pretended to care. I caught her scrolling through social media during the eulogy and said nothing. What was the point? The lawyer, Mr. Kramer, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He was an older man, same age as Harold had been, with a voice that sounded worn and brittle, like parchment stretched too thin. He began to read, formal and flat, detailing numbers and names, minor possessions and deposits. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said it. The ranch in Kettle Springs, passed down to me. Mildred, the sole inheritor of that dusty stretch of land Harold had refused to sell for decades. I hadn't set foot on that ranch in 20 years. We'd lived in town by then, and the place had grown wild and quiet, too large for just the two of us and too full of ghosts for me to visit alone. Maisie didn't even wait for the full sentence to end. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and theatrical, like someone playing a villain on stage, and said, "Oh, keep your dump. Just get out of our lives." It landed like a slap. I turned slowly to look at her, half expecting Quinn to step in, to say something, anything, that might dull the edge of it. But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, like he was watching a movie he didn't like but didn't want to walk out on. The lawyer cleared his throat again, hesitating this time, as if unsure whether to continue or let the silence drag itself out like a body too heavy to lift. I felt something shift inside me, not pain exactly, not even shock, but the kind of hollow ache you get when something that was rotting finally falls away. It wasn't new. Not really. But this time, it was finished. I looked at Quinn again. My son. The boy I'd once sat up with during nights of fever and nightmares. The boy I'd fed, clothed, defended. The boy I'd protected from his own father's quiet, bitter tempers. He didn't look at me. His eyes flicked toward the door as if wondering how long this would take. His silence was louder than Maisie's cruelty. There was no shouting. No scene. Just the clean, soft cut of knowing I was no longer wanted. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, and picked up my handbag from the floor. The lawyer murmured something about final signatures and paperwork to follow. I nodded, not fully listening. My heart wasn't racing. My breath was even. And yet, something had been torn loose, something that had clung on out of habit more than hope. I didn't look back as I walked to the door. There was nothing behind me worth carrying forward. The ranch, that old, dusty place I'd once hated for taking Harold's time, and then missed for the silence it offered, was mine now. And in that moment, it felt less like a burden and more like a door that had quietly swung open after decades locked. They didn't come after me. They didn't call out. They just let me go, as if I'd never been theirs to begin with. And I walked out into the gray afternoon light, not angry, not broken, just done. The box labeled "Pantry, Donate" sat open on the counter, half filled with unopened jars of jam, old spices, and a tin of tea Harold had brought back from a trip to Vermont before the stroke slowed him down. I stood there, hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug I hadn't packed yet, and tried to remember what this kitchen looked like the day we moved in. The walls had been yellow then, bright, loud, too cheerful. Levi hated it, said it made the room feel like a nursery. I'd painted it pale green after Quinn was born. That color was still underneath the wallpaper, under the dozens of choices made and undone over 40 years. Every room in that house held layers of time, not just furniture or knickknacks, but fingerprints, laughter, slammed doors, and long silences. And now I was packing it all into boxes labeled in black marker. Trash, keep for now, storage, junk. I read the word again and again on those boxes, as if it might change. But no matter how carefully I had wrapped the photographs, no matter how gently I folded Quinn's old kindergarten art or the postcards Levi sent from out-of-state work trips, they all ended up with that same word scribbled across them in someone else's handwriting. Maisie hadn't even tried to hide her contempt. She stood in the living room 3 days after the will was read, arms crossed, eyes scanning my life like it was a cluttered garage. "This stuff doesn't mean anything to anyone but you," she had said, like that was a kindness. Quinn had stood behind her, silent as always, not even pretending to soften the blow. The movers came the next morning. 2 boys, barely out of high school, lifting boxes without asking questions, their small talk too polite to pierce the air. I watched them carry out the mirror Levi and I bought on our 5th anniversary, the one that used to hang above the fireplace before it cracked during that bad storm in '89. No one stopped to ask if I wanted to keep it. By then, it was easier to let things be taken than to fight for what no one else valued. By late afternoon, the house was hollowed out. My voice echoed in the hallway. The bedroom felt like a shell. I stood in the doorway and looked around. The nail holes where wedding photos had hung, the worn grooves in the floor where the dresser used to sit, the dent on the wall from that one night Levi threw his shoes too hard and then apologized for a week straight. 40 years collapsed into dust and silence, and the weight of goodbye that didn't wait for permission. When I stepped outside, the sky was overcast and sharp with wind. My suitcases stood neatly on the porch like obedient pets, waiting to follow me into the next unknown. I locked the front door and slipped the key into an envelope, wrote their names on the front, and left it in the mailbox. The drive to Kettle Springs was long and quiet. The highway unraveled like a memory, long stretches of dry fields and rusted fences, forgotten gas stations, and the occasional glimpse of a barn half swallowed by vines. The radio didn't work, and I didn't feel like humming. I watched the road, one white line after another, until the gravel turned loose and the air changed. It smelled different out here. Older, heavier, like damp soil and cedar and time that didn't care whether you were ready for it. The ranch rose slowly over the hill, familiar and foreign at once. The wooden gate creaked as I opened it, and the sound felt like a voice I hadn't heard in years. The main house leaned slightly now, the porch sagging in one corner, shutters faded to gray. Moss crept up the sides like it was reclaiming what we'd once tried to tame. The barn behind it was still standing, though the roof bowed like an old man's spine. I unlocked the front door and stepped into a room that smelled of damp wood, dust, and the faint sweetness of old hay. The air was thick, untouched. Nothing had been aired out in years. I opened a window and coughed against the stale breath of abandonment. I set my bags down and looked around. Everything here was Levi's, his father's hat still hanging by the door, a pair of boots by the fireplace, a faded calendar from 1997 pinned above the kitchen sink. No one had bothered to empty it. No one had cared. I didn't cry. Not then. I was too tired, too hollowed out. I walked through the room slowly, brushing my fingers over tabletops and picture frames, as if touching them might remind me of who I'd been the last time I was here. I opened the bedroom door and stood in the doorway. The bed was made, neatly, like someone had expected to return. But no one did. That night, I sat on the porch in a sweater that smelled of cedar and mothballs, staring out at the empty fields. I thought about the word junk and how easily it had been used to erase me. I thought about how Maisie had looked at me like I was an intruder in my own story, and how Quinn had let her. And I thought about this place, not as an ending, but maybe, somehow, as the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. The wind shifted, and I closed my eyes. The house behind me groaned like it remembered me, and I stayed. The silence was worse than I expected. It wasn't just the absence of voices, of footsteps, of a radio humming softly in the background. It was the way the quiet settled into every corner of the house, thick and unmoving, as if the walls themselves had forgotten what it meant to hold life. The floor creaked under me not because of age, but because I was the only weight left to press against it. I spoke aloud to no one, asked questions to an empty kitchen, answered myself in whispers, just to remember the sound of language shaped by my own breath. On the second morning, I stood in front of the stove and caught myself setting out a second mug for coffee, and when I realized what I was doing, I laughed once, short and bitter, then cried until my body ached. Quinn didn't call. Of course he didn't. The last thing he said to me had been in that thin, uncaring tone of his, something about how it would be easier for everyone if I just took what was mine and left them alone. As if I was the inconvenience. As if motherhood had an expiration date. I thought of him every night when I lay in the cold bed, hands folded against my chest like a mourner. I imagined him sitting on the porch of the house I built, lights on, Maisie's voice echoing from the living room, and my chair, empty beside the fireplace. He wasn't grieving me. He had already erased me. I cried most at night. During the day, I moved like someone underwater, slow and deliberate, arms heavy with memory. I started cleaning because it gave my hands something to do. First the kitchen, the old sink crusted with rust, the shelves sticky with time, spiderwebs in the corners like lace. I washed the windows, one by one, wiping until the light came through clear enough to remind me that outside, the world was still moving. I found an old broom in the pantry and swept the floor in long, slow strokes, the dust curling in the air like breath. The more I cleaned, the more the house began to shift. Rooms that had once felt abandoned started to feel paused, like they had been waiting for someone to come back and remind them they were still real. I opened the doors that had stayed shut since Levi's father passed, rooms filled with boxes, moth-eaten coats, and books long out of print. I found Levi's coat hanging behind a door, still smelling of soil and pine, and I pressed my face into the collar and stayed like that for minutes, motionless, breathing in the past like it might anchor me. I found my old journals too, one from 1986, pages warped from moisture, filled with notes on garden plans and arguments about money and the way Levi snored after long days. I sat at the kitchen table and read them aloud, my voice cracking, remembering the younger version of myself who had once believed the world would always stay within reach. That woman was braver than I gave her credit for. So I began writing again. I found a lined notebook in a drawer, and used, still smelling faintly of paper and glue, and started putting down the days, not because I thought anyone would read them, but because the silence needed somewhere to go. I wrote about the dust and the wind and how the house groaned at night when the temperature dropped. I wrote about Quinn, about how the first time he got sick as a baby I sat up for 27 hours watching him breathe, how he used to call me Mama, even after he turned 10. I wrote about the way Maisie looked at me like I was a mistake, and how I had let her. I wrote about Levi, how I used to watch him from the window when he came back from the fields, one shoulder always lower than the other, his hat tilted back, face streaked with dirt and sun and pride. And somewhere in those pages, I stopped writing like someone who had been discarded. The loneliness didn't leave. It pressed at me in the quiet moments, when the sky turned pink and the house felt too wide, when the wind carried sounds that didn't belong to anyone anymore. But there was something else growing, something small but solid, a new kind of voice that didn't beg to be heard, but spoke anyway. Not for them, for me. By the end of that week, I had a rhythm. Morning coffee, a walk around the property, an hour in the diary, one drawer or cabinet or closet tackled each day. The house was still too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts. But it was mine, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman who had survived. It was behind the pantry wall, tucked behind a warped wood panel that had always stuck out slightly, though I'd never paid it much mind before. I was on my knees scrubbing the floor when I saw it again. That narrow gap where the wood didn't quite meet flush, the nails a little too crooked. I don't know what made me pull at it that day. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was habit, my hands looking for a task, even when my heart wasn't sure what it wanted. The board gave way with a reluctant groan, and behind it, covered in dust and spiderwebs, was a dull metal box, the kind you'd expect to find under a child's bed, not hidden in a pantry wall. It was heavier than I expected. I sat cross-legged on the floor, legs stiff and cold, and wiped the grime off the lid with the sleeve of my sweater. The latch creaked open with effort. Inside, everything was dry and well-preserved. Someone had taken care to seal it tight, to make sure time couldn't touch what was hidden there. At first, it looked like old letters. Dozens of them, neatly tied in faded blue ribbon, all written in looping, elegant handwriting that flowed across yellowed pages like song. The envelopes were thin and brittle, each postmarked in the 1940s, stamped from small towns in Texas and northern Mexico. I unfolded one carefully, and though my Spanish was poor, I recognized enough to understand it wasn't business or war or politics being spoken of, it was love. A woman named Elena. Phrases repeated across multiple letters. Te espero en la luz. Mi vida bajo la tierra. And again, some variation of Si desaparece la codicia, seremos libres. If greed disappears, we will be free. I paused, heart tapping a little louder. The name at the bottom of one of the pages, not Elena's, but the person she was writing to, stopped me. It wasn't Levi, but it was a name I knew from a deed Levi kept locked away. A name tied to his grandfather, a man who worked this land when the ranch was still wild, back before oil money flooded parts of the county and faded just as quickly. I kept reading. The letters began to shift tone halfway through the stack. The early ones were soft, poetic, filled with longing. But the later ones were sharper, tense phrases about land surveys, mineral rights, pressure from outside men. And then, suddenly, a map folded neatly beneath the ribbon. It wasn't like the maps Levi used for irrigation or fencing. This was hand-drawn, with contour lines and shaded sections, a mark in red ink deep beneath the property's eastern ridge. It was labeled Vein 3, and next to it, in the same handwriting, the words confirmed, copper, and silver. I felt my stomach tighten. I spread the map out flat and found 3 more underneath it, copies of geological surveys, diagrams showing bore samples, cross-sections of land formations. All signed, all dated, all real. And tucked under those, beneath a faded photograph of a young woman standing in front of what looked like a mine shaft, eyes dark, dress white, hair braided and long down her back, was a small notebook. It was Levi's handwriting this time. I recognized it instantly. The same uneven loops, the way he crossed his T's like he was striking matches. He hadn't told me. I flipped through the notebook and found notes written over years, calculations, dates of rainfall, shifts in the land, mentions of keeping the shaft sealed, never drilling without full title clearance. Then a final entry, years later, in a different tone. Too much greed. The land deserves peace. Elena was right. I sat back against the wall, the box still open beside me, the photograph in my hand. I don't know how long I stayed there. The sun had moved further across the kitchen floor by the time I stood again. Everything in me was buzzing, but not from fear. From something else. The realization that Levi had known all along, that the land he worked, the land he refused to sell, was worth something far beyond cattle or hay. But he kept it quiet, because he believed what she wrote, that freedom only came when greed disappeared. I placed everything back inside the box with care. The letters, the maps, the notebook. I tied the ribbon again, not to hide it, but to honor it. I looked out the window toward the eastern ridge, where the grass grew thicker, where the barn cast its long shadow, where time had whispered truths no one had bothered to listen to. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew this much. Levi left more than memories behind. And buried beneath the dust and quiet of this forgotten place was a secret meant to be found. I sat at the kitchen table with the metal box open beside me, the morning light slanting through the newly cleaned windows in soft golden streaks. The letters, the map, the photograph of Elena. They lay there like pieces of a life I hadn't known existed, and the longer I stared at them, the more the silence of the house felt heavy with meaning. I needed answers, but there was only one person left alive who might hold the thread I was missing. I picked up the phone and dialed slowly, each number a small act of hope. "Ruth," I said when she answered, her voice as warm and worn as ever. There was a pause before she replied. "Millie? My God, I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Are you all right?" I didn't know how to answer that. "I'm at the ranch," I said instead. "Levi left it to me." My voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "I found something, Ruth. In the pantry. Letters. Maps. From the 40s. And a photo." Her name was Elena. The silence on the other end stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with recognition. "Samuel," Ruth said finally, so softly I barely heard it. "Samuel Morrison, your husband's grandfather." I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for days. "You remember him?" Of course I remember him. We all called him Levi back then, like it was a title. He was one of the first settlers out here with enough grit to work the ridge. But he wasn't just ranching. He was mining. Copper, mostly, maybe silver. Quiet about it. Kept to himself. "And Elena?" I asked. A pause again, longer this time. Then Ruth sighed. She was his wife. Sweet girl. From Durango, I think. Smart, quiet, with a backbone made of steel. He met her during one of his trips south. Came back with her, and never said much about the how or why. She used to sing outside when she worked in the garden. You could hear her all the way down to the creek. But she died young, in childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. After that, Samuel changed. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. The letters. The way she wrote about greed and land and freedom. The map drawn with such care. Her handwriting full of longing. It was real. Did anyone know he was mining on the property? I asked. Some suspected, Ruth said. But he never made a show of it. No trucks. No hired men. Just him, working alone, keeping records in that little notebook he never let out of his sight. I heard once that he had licenses, proper ones, signed off in the county courthouse, but no one ever found them after he died. And he made Levi promise to keep the land in the family. Always. He said it was worth more than anyone knew, but only if it stayed quiet. And now, I whispered, more to myself than to her. It's in my hands. Yes, Ruth said gently. I suppose it is. You were always the one with your feet on the ground, Millie. Maybe he saw that in you. Maybe Levi did too. I leaned back in my chair, the words sitting heavy on my chest. Samuel had carried this truth with him his entire life. The love, the loss, the land. And somehow, through time and silence and decisions I hadn't understood, it had made its way to me. Not by chance. Not by accident. By choice. Ruth's voice broke softly through the quiet. It's not just a farm, Millie. It's a promise. One that skipped everyone else and landed in your lap. You have to decide what to do with it now. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time. I could hear the creak of the beams overhead, the wind nudging against the eaves, the rustle of leaves against the side of the barn. The map was still on the table, corners curled, ink fading. Elena's letters lay folded beside it, her voice echoing across decades in words meant for someone else, and maybe, in the end, meant for me. I wasn't a miner. I wasn't a pioneer. But I understood quiet loyalty, and I understood what it meant to be trusted with something fragile and old and powerful. This wasn't just inheritance. It was legacy. Samuel had buried it. Levi had protected it. And now I had found it. Not a coincidence. A responsibility. The basement smelled of stone and time. The steps groaned beneath my weight as I descended slowly, a flashlight in one hand, the other trailing along the rough wall for balance. I hadn't been down there since the first day, when I opened the door, saw the darkness, and shut it again, telling myself there was no reason to go poking through the shadows. But after that call with Ruth, and after spending hours rereading Samuel's maps and Elena's letters, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't finished telling its story. The flashlight beam caught on dust floating in the air like ash, soft and slow, and I moved past the shelves of old paint cans and cracked jars until I reached the back wall. The stone there looked newer, more even, like someone had patched it differently. I pressed against it out of instinct, not expecting anything, but the hollow sound told me what I needed to know. My fingers found the edge of a thin wooden frame, and I wedged it loose with the end of an old screwdriver from a crate nearby. Behind it was a shallow cavity, no more than a foot deep, wrapped in tarp and tied shut with twine like someone had buried a secret and still wanted it to breathe. I untied the twine slowly, the plastic rustling in the dark, and inside I found 2 large manila envelopes, thick with papers. I sat down on the cool stone floor and opened the first one. Inside were recent geological studies, real, professional, glossy even, dated less than 5 years ago. Each page was stamped with the insignia of a major energy company. The data was technical but clear enough. Copper, silver, possibly lithium, all of it running like a spine beneath the eastern ridge. Several bore samples, satellite mapping, core extractions. I flipped to the final page and found a cover letter. It was addressed to Levi Morrison. The offer was typed cleanly, with the kind of confidence only money knows how to use. They were offering $2 million up front, plus royalties from all future mineral rights, contingent on sole ownership and no contested claims. They wanted exclusivity. They wanted access. They wanted everything Levi had spent his life protecting. I opened the second envelope and expected more of the same, but it held something different. Hand-drawn maps like the ones I'd seen before, and then, folded twice with sharp creases, a letter in Levi's handwriting. Not a copy. The real thing. Just a single sheet of paper torn from his work journal. I read it once in full before I let myself breathe again. Mildred deserves better, it said. I've kept this quiet all these years because people like Maisie wouldn't think twice about selling off what isn't theirs. But you know her, Quinn does too. They want easy. They want fast. This land is old, and it's worth more than money, but the money is real. And if anything happens to me before I can finish this, she needs to know that I never meant to leave her empty-handed. Don't let that woman ruin everything. There was no signature, just his name printed at the bottom in capital letters, the way he always wrote it when he wanted something to be final. I sat with the letter in my lap, the envelope resting on my knees, the quiet humming around me like a low chord held too long. Levi had known. He had commissioned the studies himself. He had confirmed everything Samuel suspected, and he'd done it not for himself, not for pride, not even for Quinn. He did it for me. Not because he thought I needed rescuing, but because he knew I had already been discarded, and he wanted to make sure I had the tools to rebuild. My throat tightened. I reached up and touched the wall beside me, palm against the stone, and for a moment I swore I could feel Levi's presence in that cold stillness. Not a voice, not a ghost, just the weight of him. The way he stood when he was thinking, the scent of his work shirt when he came in after long hours outside. He had a plan, and death took him too soon. But he had left me everything I needed to finish it. The lawyer's office in Kettle Springs wasn't much to look at. 2 rooms above a pharmacy, the waiting area crammed with too many plants and not enough chairs, a secretary who called everyone sweetheart, even when her tone said she didn't mean it. But the man himself, Richard Halpern, came highly recommended by Ruth and had been doing mineral contracts for 30 years. He read every line twice, made notes in red ink, explained everything slowly and without condescension. I brought the studies, the surveys, the letters, and he read them all without blinking. "You've got something real here, Mrs. Morrison," he said, tapping the edge of the offer with a pen. "And rare. Most folks don't get this lucky. Or if they do, it's already been pulled out from under them by someone smarter or faster or meaner. I'm none of those, I said. No, he smiled. But you're careful, and that counts for something. The final offer was higher than the original. A $4 million advance for rights to begin exploratory work on the land, plus $500,000 in quarterly payments beginning the first month of extraction. Royalties were separate. I didn't ask for more than Levi had outlined in his notes. I didn't want greed to rot what had been protected so carefully. I signed my name with a steady hand, the pen gliding across the paper without hesitation. There was no joy in it, not the kind people expect when they talk about windfalls or jackpots or life-changing deals. It felt quiet, right, like sealing a promise made long ago by a man who never got to see the end of it. I didn't tell Ruth right away. I didn't tell anyone. I drove home with the signed contract in my purse and made dinner like it was any other evening. The next morning, I had 3 missed calls. 1 from Quinn, 2 from a number I didn't recognize. I ignored them. By afternoon, it was 13. By nightfall, it was 32. And by the end of the next day, it was 62. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't answer the texts. I sat at the kitchen table with the letters from Elena spread out before me and the fire crackling in the stove, and I let the phone buzz on the counter like it had nothing to do with me. Because it didn't. Not anymore. They knew. Somehow they knew. Maybe someone at the courthouse had talked. Maybe one of the contractors had let something slip. Or maybe it was just instinct. The way people who had once dismissed you suddenly develop an ear for opportunity the second it's no longer theirs. But I didn't flinch. Because for the first time in my life, I held something they couldn't touch. Not just money. Power. The first real apology came at 7:42 a.m., wrapped in a voicemail Quinn must have practiced a dozen times before recording. His voice trembled just enough to suggest sincerity, but I knew him well enough to hear the calculation behind it. Mom, he said, I didn't know how bad it got. I should have been there. Maisie. Well, she's got a sharp tongue sometimes, but we didn't mean it. You shouldn't be alone out there. Let's talk, okay? Maybe you can stay with us a while, maybe, above the garage. It's warm. We fixed it up. I stood in the kitchen, the phone cold in my hand, staring out at the field beyond the back porch where the frost had only just begun to lift from the grass. Above the garage. That was their version of mercy, an attic with a hot plate and a shared bathroom. And now, suddenly, they wanted to talk. Now that the world had cracked open and they realized what I'd been given. Now that I had value again. Maisie was less subtle. Her messages were faster, longer, filled with the kind of tears that only come when money is on the line. I was angry, she said. We were all grieving, and I just didn't know how to process everything. But we're family, Mildred. That means something. We can start over. You could help us set up a college fund for the girls. You'd love to see them more often. They've been asking about you. That last part was a lie. I knew it. Those children didn't know me, and they never had. I was the quiet shadow at birthdays, the woman who brought casseroles and got cut out of the family photos before they made it to the frames. I played the messages on speaker once, standing in the middle of the house I had swept and scrubbed and woken back to life with my own hands. Then I turned the phone off and let the silence return like a trusted friend. That evening, Quinn called again, not to plead this time, but to pressure. I'm trying, Mom, he said. But this affects all of us. You can't just make decisions like this without thinking about the family. We're your blood. I answered that one. I sat down in Levi's old armchair, my feet tucked under me, the smell of wood smoke still clinging to the sleeves of my sweater. You gave up on me, Quinn, I said calmly. In a lawyer's office, in front of strangers, while your wife told me to disappear. And you let her. You let her look me in the face and say I wasn't worth the space I took up. You stood there and said nothing. He started to interrupt, but I didn't let him. I didn't ask for this land, I continued. I didn't go looking for silver or copper or letters from the past. But it found me. Your grandfather wanted this in the right hands. Levi made sure I'd have it when the time came. And now that you know what it's worth, you found your voice again. But I don't owe you anything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, thick and awkward. Then, so that's it? You're just going to cut us off? No, I said. I'm finally going to choose myself. That's not cruelty, Quinn. That's survival. I ended the call and turned the phone off for good. There was no rage in me, no triumphant music swelling behind the moment. Just a long, deep quiet. The kind that comes when something heavy slips from your shoulders after years of pretending you could carry it forever. They had called it family. But family doesn't throw you out and come back only when the vault is open. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for a seat at someone else's table. I had built my own. It's been 6 months, though some mornings I still wake up surprised by the softness of the sheets, by the way the light falls through the clean window panes I replaced myself, by the silence that no longer stings, just rests gently across the floor like a quilt folded over waiting wood. The ranch doesn't feel haunted anymore. It feels lived in. It smells of eucalyptus and cinnamon and the faint, pleasant scent of paper and ink from the library I built upstairs, where I spend hours hunched over books I never had time for before. There's a camera on the kitchen table now, not the old disposable kind I used to take to family picnics, but a sturdy Nikon with weight and purpose. I bought it in Santa Fe after I stood in front of a gallery wall and realized I'd spent decades looking after people but never really seeing things. Now I spend hours following light. The way it curves over rusted fences, the gold it catches in my hair just before sunset, the way fog settles over the ridge like a secret too old to tell. I take photos of tree bark, of the pattern shadows make on the barn's warped siding, of myself in the mirror with my mouth relaxed, not smiling for anyone but not apologizing for it either. I'm learning mineralogy too, slowly, stubbornly, hunched over study guides with a pencil in my hand and a dictionary close by. The names are hard, but the patterns are beautiful, and when I walk the fields now, I don't just see soil. I see layers, pressure, time, the quiet kind of creation that doesn't ask to be praised. There are stamps on my passport now. Vancouver, Lisbon, Oaxaca. I keep a jar on the mantel filled with tickets and napkins and maps creased along my fingers. I sit in cafes and watch people without trying to make myself invisible. I speak slowly and often laugh when I forget the words. I'm not trying to be impressive anymore. I'm trying to be present. The letters started coming in late March. First from Lily, the youngest, shaky handwriting, a drawing of a horse and a note that said, "Dear Grandma, I hope you are not sick anymore." I laughed until I cried. Then Sadie wrote. Then Oliver. None of them mentioned Maisie. She left, I've gathered. Quietly, and for good. I didn't ask for details. Quinn's letters are clumsier, unsure. "I'm sorry," he writes. "I didn't understand. I thought you'd always be there." Sometimes I write back. Sometimes I wait. He is not the boy I raised, but he is trying, and that counts for something. Maybe.